Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am thrilled to have my coworker Katherine with us today, and she's an editorial manager here at GFP. And today we're talking all about production editing. So, Katherine, first of all, what is production editing?
Production editing starts after the developmental edit is finished, and it is really getting the manuscript refined and ready to go to the printer. There's also some elements that happen after print, but it is the process of getting that book through the final stages so it is ready to go out into the world.
So, what's the difference between a production edit and a developmental edit?
Yeah, so a developmental edit is when the story is still being built. Like the author has come, you've got your ideas, you've written a first draft, maybe sent it to some beta readers, but maybe you're not happy with how your characters are coming across, or some of the themes aren't fully developed. There's still more writing that needs to happen. So you and your dev editor will work through that through maybe one pass, maybe two passes. And by the time it comes to your production editing team, you are done writing. You're happy with the story. You're happy with the characters. You've said what you wanted to say. And then it'll go through a copy edit and a proofread. It might even get a second read that we call a cold read. And what we're doing there is we're taking what's already in the manuscript and we are making sure that it conforms with like industry standards, that your voice is consistent, that you don't have any grammatical errors in there, or if you do, they're ones you wanted to make on purpose. But we're not adding new things. It's not a time to rewrite. It's really about refining what you've got in your manuscript.
It's probably hard to answer this question, but is there like a typical time range as to how long it takes to do a production edit?
It depends on the book's length. It also depends somewhat on, is the book like a standard novel or does it have images in there? Are we doing a lot of different things with layout? Um, it depends how many services you're doing. I'd say in the publishing industry, it's pretty typical to see a copy edit, a proofread, and a cold read. And if it's for a novel without the extra considerations of layout, usually it's like 3 or 4 weeks for your copy edits. And then the author has a couple weeks to review the editor's changes, decide what they want to keep, what they don't. It's not a time to rewrite, but it is a time to say, like, oh, the editor rephrased it this way, and actually I prefer it this way. Then it goes to the proofreader, and they usually have maybe 2 weeks, maybe three if it's a really long manuscript with it. And then the same process where the author gets a chance to review the proofreader's work, decide what they want to keep, what they don't want to keep. A cold read usually is like 7 to 10 business days because the cold reader is just looking for typos and the really obvious stuff that like someone would leave a comment on your Google review of like, you spelled this word wrong.
Oh,
And
yeah.
we might not even send those changes back to the author to review because they should be so cut and dry, like obviously errors. And so that's a faster process.
Can an author ever skip a production edit? Because that's a lot of editing. So, like industry-wise, is that a thing? And at Girl
Mhm.
Friday, is that a thing?
So industry-wise, if you're being traditionally published, if you're doing hybrid publishing, um, if you want your book to really seem like it's professionally done, if you're going your own route instead of doing hybrid or traditional publishing, you can't skip the production edits. You could maybe skip the cold read. Some people will try to start their edit at a proofread, but it's really like the standard practice is to do all three. If you are self-publishing, maybe you're wanting to do a book that's just for you and your family, you're not really worried about distribution, then you can probably be a little more choosy about which parts of production editing you want to include. I would never recommend cutting all of them, because, you're putting so much time and effort and emotion into your book. Why wouldn't you want it to be as good as you possibly can make it? But I think that's probably the only instance where you'd have the option to not do production editing is if you are self-publishing and you've decided that, what you've got is what you want and you don't really care what other people think about it. Um, yeah. And at Girl Friday, we will always recommend a copy edit and a proofread. Sometimes, very rarely, we have clients come to us and maybe they've gotten a copy edit done somewhere else, and so they don't want to do another one. And in that case, we typically will have someone from the production editor's team review the manuscript and see if we're like, yeah, okay, this could start at proofread, or if maybe the editor that did it previously was focused more on line editing and really it still could use a copy edit.
So how does the production editing process work at Girl Friday?
Sure. So at Girl Friday, we have a team of production editors, and that team all has a set number of books that we're working on at the same time. So, as much as we love books and editing, we're not actually the ones editing these books unless they're really, really, really short. What we do is we will reach out to freelancers who have already, like, we already know their work. We know they're good at what they do. They have to take a test to work with us. We review all their resumes. Like our freelance pool was pretty solid. And so we will send a book out to be copy edited or proofed. And then when the freelancer's done, they send it back to us and we review their changes, we review their comments. We have certain checks that we run through before it even goes back to the author. And we also are available to answer the author's questions if they're like, why do they keep putting this comma here? We can give them a reason why. And typically, the author is not going to converse directly with the editor, they'll converse with their production editor. So, really, we're like quality control for the different rounds of production editing that go through. But once a book is put in layout, so that's once it's no longer in Word, it's been put into a PDF, so you have a really good idea on the screen of what it's going to look like in print. Then the actual production editing team does do what we call a format proof, where we're just looking visually at what it looks like on the page to
Right.
make sure that it looks good. There's no weird spacing in there. There's no pages where like one page ends here and the other ends here, and that's stuff that we do in-house. I keep an eye on industry news, and I know when I've seen job postings for production editors, typically part of the role is managing freelancers. So I think that perhaps it used to be more common for the big five to have their editors in-house, and more that's being outsourced. You don't have to have a degree or certificate, but we do appreciate it when people do. Just about everybody on our team has a certificate in editing or maybe a like minor in writing.
Mhm.
Um, what we really, really need is our production editors and people who are working in production editorial stages is to have a great knowledge of the Chicago Manual of Style, which for those who aren't in the know, for the publishing industry, if it's not an academic book or like a cookbook or very specific genres, it's going to be formatted in the Chicago Manual of Style. And probably you've read countless books that have that formatting and you haven't noticed. But there's certain rules that like all books follow somewhat. And so we expect our editors to know what those rules are. And they get updated every few years. The latest edition just came out, I think, last year. And so some of the rules that we've all memorized, we're having to revisit and maybe adjust, which isn't very easy for editors. But that is really our big go-to is do you know Chicago, not just you think you know Chicago. And also our editors need to have a really good commenting manner. So it's one thing to be able to spot something that needs to be changed. It's another to be able to communicate it in a way that's clear for the author, that's respectful of the author, and that acknowledges, like, you've written a whole book. I don't expect you to have perfect grammar in every line. Um, the reason I'm suggesting this change is, for clarity, I want the readers to get your point and not get caught up in the grammar.
What's the difference between a good, a bad, or a great production editor? Now, you just talked about they have to just be seeped in Chicago manual style, but are there other things that
Yeah,
you think is like this person is top notch?
I think so. I think timeliness in the production role is really important. There's a little more flexibility with print on demand runs than print runs, but we still like if one thing in production is late, it pushes everything back. So timeliness is really important. The ability to communicate well with authors and with other editors, with other members of production. And when I'm saying members of production, I mean with the design team, with the publishing manager, with everybody who's working to get that book out. So communication is really, really important. And I'd say in terms of what can be a negative trait for editors is when you're so caught up in what sounds right and feels right to you that you can't separate your opinion from like, okay, well, the way the author said this isn't how I would say it, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean it needs to change. And we spend a lot of time when we work with newer editors, kind of coaching them on that of like, why did you make that change? Why did you flag that? And so knowing the difference is really important. And it's something I think that just people learn over time.
When a production editor makes comments, do, does the author have to accept them? Now, obviously, if there's a typo or something like that, that's a given. But is there ever like a point of contention, like the editor says you should change this, and the author's like, no way.
Oh, constantly. Yeah. It's always a
Really?
back and forth. Yeah. Especially with, if it's things like setting a tone. Maybe it's dialogue. The author's definitely going to have their vision of this is how this character sounds. This is what this character would think about that. And it may or may not fit with the grammar and tone. And like, I don't know any editors that get worked up about an author saying, like, don't make that change. But on the flip side, something I've noticed is that really experienced authors are very selective on what we call it stetting. When you tell the editor, don't change this, leave it how I had it, is called a stet. They're very selective in what they stet. So they don't sweat the small stuff like, okay, you're gonna always have a comma before and when it's items in a series. Like they don't care. If it has to do with their character's voice, that's when they might say something. And then with newer authors, we tend to get more pushback of like, well, my English teacher told me to do it this way. And they're probably right, but it's not Chicago style,
Uh,
which is why we're calling that out.
what is an author's experience? Because you work with the authors and you meet them and walk them through this process. Do they enjoy this process, the production editing process? Is it painful? What do they say at the end of it? Because I know I have my opinions we get them in marketing, what they're saying, but what do you think that they think?
Yeah. I think after the process is over, they're usually like, wow. They're really excited about how much like cleaner and more professional their book is. I would say the actual process is quite difficult. It's a lot to go through. They have to use words track changes just because that's what works best for making sure that what they want changed and what we see them wanting changed is in alignment. And it can be hard to learn the software if they're not familiar with it.
Yeah.
For copy edits, especially, it can be frustrating to see a high number of changes. I'm sure it feels like, oh, like I messed that up. I made errors, but really it's just us trying to make it industry standard for the styling. Um, but it's a lot to go through. It's tedious to sit through and click through all the changes. And we actually end up telling our authors, after you've started, if you feel like, yes, this editor knows what they're doing, I don't need to see every comma and period swap. I don't need to see every semicolon that got cut or changed. Um, they can just search for what we call queries, which is where we leave comments. They're labeled with AU. So it's just the stuff that we need the author's input of like, were you trying to say this or were you trying to say that? And that can speed up the process for them quite a bit. What we're seeing right now with when authors bring up AI, it's usually like, "Ugh, okay, here we go." So, trying to remember an example I had recently where it was like a particular word was like we corrected how it was used, and they were like, well, AI said I used it correctly. And we're like, well, if you'd been using it as a noun, AI would have been right. But in this case, you're using it as a verb. And so, no, AI is not right. And so right now, it's pretty much just an extra step for us to like, okay, is what the author's saying AI said actually right? Like, did Chicago get updated? Oh, no, it's pulling from old information. Super. And that's not to say that it's
Oh,
never right.
yeah.
Um, but so for now, it hasn't been super helpful. I could see some of the more tedious parts of editing. maybe AI helping out with in the future. Um, but I think where the editor's value comes in is the ability to start sensing the author's tone and like what were they doing with the story. So like maybe it does make sense that in certain cases we pull back on the commas just for pacing. And I think it's going to take AI a really long time to be able to figure that out. Of like, there's an emotional arc happening here. The character would be rushing through what they're saying. We're not going to worry so much about like, oh, well, that was a dependent clause followed by a blah, blah, blah. So we're going to put a comma here. Um, so I think having that human touch is still really important.
In a production edit, can an author ever do it themselves? Or maybe they have someone that, I'm going to give it to my friend, I'm going to give it to my spouse, and they can do it. Is that a thing? What's your hot take?
Well, that's a thing that we've seen happen, and it's always sort of one of those, okay. So, our authors will look over the digital proof of their books. They're not supposed to like edit it again because by the time we're at digital proof, we're like about to go to print. Um, but some of them will read through and they'll make a couple changes here and there, and that's fine. But when you're looking at your own work, especially, a book you've spent a year on, you've seen so many drafts, you've seen it change so many times. Like it's just human nature that your brain's going to fill in different gaps, or like instead of reading the sentence how it actually reads on the page, you're going to think about what you wanted it to say. So it's really hard to look at your own stuff and do an edit. And then when people have their friends or their family take a look to do edits, I think that's great for a beta draft. It's great for when you're trying to get your story shaped, get an idea of like, is what I'm trying to do here making sense? But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of like, is this punctuated properly? Then we run into a lot of the stuff of, like I said before, my English teacher told me to do it this way. Well, great, but your English teacher was doing a different style than Chicago, or Chicago has changed since then. Or I had one author who she'd written her whole book based on like a childhood memory, a very significant childhood event. And so the language she had chosen was language her younger self would have used. And we were at like the final stage about to go into layout, I think, and she has a friend read it, and they're like, that was distracting for me. I don't like that you used such like youthful language. And she was like, oh no, did I do it wrong? Like, should I change it? And we had a nice long conversation about what she was trying to do with the book and what would make sense for her narrator to use as a child going through these things, and we decided it was just fine the way it was. But there's always the danger that an uninformed opinion is going to come and potentially mess up your book. I think it would have been disastrous if she'd gone through and started throwing all these grown-up words into this child's mouth.
Wow. I had no idea what you were going to say there. I was like, is she going to go back and rewrite that whole thing?
Thankfully, no. But it did take a like face-to-face call of like, please don't. Like, you've created
Wow.
something beautiful here. Please don't go back and redo it. Maybe a final thing I wish authors knew about production editing in the process is that a good editor isn't judging what you've written. Like personally, when I get to edit instead of just doing QC, like it's never in my head like, oh, this author doesn't know how to use a serial comma, or they don't know whether or not it should be capitalized after a colon. Like that's never in my head. Um, you have created a whole world, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, a whole story. You have done the hard part. So even though it can be a little bit overwhelming when you get an edit back and you see all the markup in it, your editor's just wanting to help your words get through the way that you intended them, I think, by making all those changes. And so I hope that authors feel really good about their book and feel a lot of ownership about their book and don't feel like editors are trying to pick it apart. Because if your editor's trying to take you apart, they're not doing a very good job. Um, they should be trying to like highlight what you've done and make sure that what you want to say is coming across.